Welcome everyone. My name is Diego Ramos-Toro, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Economics here at Dartmouth. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of our department to this fall's lecture on inequality, discrimination, and opportunity. I would like to extend a special welcome to the students currently enrolled in Economics 1 who are just beginning their study of the discipline. This lecture series grew out of the Economics Department's commitments to racial justice articulated in June 2020. The primary purpose of our event is to deepen Dartmouth students' understanding of the world of inequality, discrimination, and opportunity in society, and how economics can increase our understanding of this phenomenon and inform policy responses. This now biannual event is co-sponsored with the State Alexander Association. I would now like to turn the microphone over to Alex, one of its members, who will introduce today's speaker, Maggie Jones.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Alex Honda. I'm a junior majoring in economics here at Dartmouth. I currently serve as one of the vice presidents of the Sadie Alexander Association, an organization that works to promote underrepresented backgrounds within the economics department. We collaborate closely with students from international backgrounds, first-generation students, and the economics faculty to ensure that the study and practice of economics reflect a wide range of perspectives and lived experiences. One of the ways we pursue this mission is through the Legal Lecture Series, a joint effort between the Sadie Alexander Association and the Economics Department to bring groundbreaking scholars and conversations to our campus. On behalf of both the Sadie Alexander Association and the Dartmouth Department of Economics, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Professor Maggie Jones. Professor Jones is an associate professor of economics at McGill University and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Her work sits at the intersection of economic history and labor economics, with a central focus on understanding the institutional roots of socioeconomic inequalities in North America. Her research also examines the effectiveness of policies designed to support marginalized populations, offering critical insights into both their potential and their limitations. Professor Jones' scholarship highlights two major themes: the economic legacy of colonization among indigenous populations and the economics of the civil rights era. Through careful empirical research, drawing on administrative records and original data sets she compiles from primary sources, she sheds light on how historical processes continue to shape present-day outcomes and opportunities. Her talk this evening, titled "The Economic Legacy of Colonialism Among Indigenous Populations in North America," explores how economics can serve as a powerful framework for understanding the long-term effects of colonialism, assessing contemporary policies, and envisioning future paths toward prosperity. This discussion will trace the lasting economic impacts of colonialism, evaluate modern policy interventions, and consider how human capital formation fits into this ongoing story. We're deeply grateful to have Professor Jones here with us to share her insights and expand our understanding of how economics can confront and contextualize historical inequities. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Maggie Jones.
Okay, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm going to try and go without the mic, so just wave your hands if I start to talk really quiet. So it's really a pleasure to be here on the traditional lands of the Abenaki people today to present kind of a summary of the research in this space that I've been working in for, if we count grad school, about the last 10 years or so. So I'd like to start with this map of Canada and the United States. And the map has been overlaid with the ancestral homelands of Indigenous nations as of about 1600. So these boundaries you can think of as being fluid. They weren't, kind of set in stone, and they definitely changed over time. So you can think of this as just a snapshot of Indigenous nations just around the time of contact. Now, I want to put a few different points on the map here, or point out a few different points that are particularly important to me from the last few years to several decades of my life. So currently I'm living in Montreal, right here, which was on the traditional homelands of the Kanien'kehá:ka people. You may know of these people by their English name, the Mohawk. But for 3 years before that, I lived in Atlanta down here. That's on the traditional homelands of the Muskogee people, again by their English name, the Creek. And I grew up here on the island of Newfoundland in Canada, which was on the traditional homelands, or is on the traditional homelands of the Beothuk people. The reason I like to put this map up is because it makes us think about the different colonial histories of each of these different groups. So for instance, the Muskogee were forcibly removed along the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. The Kanien'kehá:ka people live on reserves near Montreal today, and the Beothuk are actually no longer in existence. So they're an extinct population due to the presence of disease, the presence of violence from settlers. So the reason I like to start many of my talks with this map is it portrays the kind of diversity of Indigenous nations historically. It gives us a sense of the kind of colonial histories that different Indigenous nations faced. And it kind of makes us think about our place and our role in creating economic opportunity, inclusive economic opportunity for all today. So what I'm going to talk about in this talk is the value of economics in thinking through the impact of those historical processes and also trying to think through policy solutions today that can help alleviate any economic disparities that we observe. When I think about this, I'm thinking both disparities maybe between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, but also disparities across Indigenous groups, because there's a lot of heterogeneity in economic outcomes, both historically and today. So if most of you are economic students, maybe some are not, I think it's still important to highlight the value of economics. So I think that we can all agree that economics can provide us with a framework for understanding how people make decisions under scarcity, right? It allows us to think through how resources are allocated in society. And in many respects, the kind of focus on math allows us to do this in a way that strips away kind of other assumptions and kind of complicating factors in our analyses. Economics also has a particular focus on causal analysis, and this allows for kind of clear policy evaluation. So it gives us some insight into what policies work in certain circumstances and what policies don't work. And I'm going to argue briefly that it has the potential to influence policy. So I have an asterisk there because I found out recently that only 6% of academic research actually gets cited by policymakers. So I don't know, for those of us who are academic economists in the room, I'm not sure if that makes you feel good or bad. Is 6% higher or lower than what we thought? Unknown. But I will argue that economics among those papers that influence policy does play a strong role. So this is a graph of the cumulative citation count of papers that were published in 2010. And it's showing over time how many of these papers get cited in policy documents. So there's a variety of policy documents that are used to construct these measures. And what you can see is that social sciences really kind of stand out as the types of work that end up influencing policy. Now, if we break this down even further, by research discipline, you can see that social sciences and kind of broadly social sciences, and then pulling out economics from the social sciences, you see that economics plays a very prominent role in the type of work that does get cited in policy. Now, that being said, economic work looking at Indigenous populations, like truly centering the narrative on Indigenous populations, does tend to be underrepresented in economics research, in academic economics research. So very few top economics journals have published work that centers the narrative on Indigenous people. Many times you'll see kind of like heterogeneity analyses. So we might be interested in a particular policy's effect, and then during a subgroup analysis, people might say, how does this policy affect white people, black people, Native Americans, et cetera? So it's kind of like in a way, an afterthought. But if economics has the potential to influence policy, and Indigenous topics are excluded from some of the top economics research, policymakers are left to make decisions in an evidentiary vacuum. So what I'm going to argue is that we need more work in economics, that economics has more work on Indigenous topics in economics, that it has provided us with important insights to now, and it can provide us with important kind of policy prescriptions moving forward. So just to kind of hone in on this a little bit more, this is the percent of parliament speaking instances in Canada related to indigeneity. And you can see, starting in about the 1970s and 1980s, the percent of speaking instances that mention something related to indigeneity has really increased quite substantially. So this is something that, at least in Canada, people care about a lot. I would venture to guess that if we did this for the United States, you would see the trend trending upwards as well. And again, just to kind of touch on this point a second time, this is from a paper by one of my regular co-authors, Dawn Fair, where Dawn took the economics literature and searched for papers that have published on Indigenous topics in Canada. So you can see that even though there's quite a substantial rise in the kind of policy interest in these topics, this is the total number of papers Dawn was able to find in top 400 economics journals. Right? So I think that there's a lot more that can be done in this space, and a lot that we can learn from using economics to understand, again, both historical persistence and the types of policies that can be implemented to alleviate poverty. So what's the big picture of this talk? Well, economics provides a valuable toolkit to understand historical processes and policy reforms. We're going to talk about how economics research has currently been used to understand both the evolution of outcomes across more or less the 20th century, and then how policies can be used to, again, contribute to reducing economic disparities. Kind of drawing on the historical literature in this space, we know that history is persistent. We know that many of the institutional or the economic disparities are institutional, and therefore they can be addressed through evidence-based policy reforms. And economics can help us with these efforts. Okay, so going from here, I'm going to give a brief overview of Indigenous people in North America, just so everyone kind of understands what I'm talking about when I describe the economics work. That's also going to include some of the work that economists and demographers have been doing in more recent years to try and get a better picture of what economic outcomes look like today and historically. And then we're going to talk about the economic impacts of historical processes, what the economics research has said on contemporary topics, future directions. If we have time, I will provide some reflections as a settler or a non-Indigenous person working in this space. So you can kind of take that with the caveats that apply, and then we'll conclude. And I will say what I'm going to focus on today is the kind of connection between income and human capital. So there's certainly a lot of research that has looked at land reform, property rights, self-governance, things like that. I'm not going to be able to touch on that in the kind of 45 minutes that I have here today. But if people are interested in that, I'm very happy to provide some references afterwards. Okay, so I've mentioned this word, Indigenous peoples. This is kind of a general term that I'm going to be using throughout the talk to more or less refer to people who are descended from the original inhabitants of the land. So different Indigenous groups have different kind of notions of identity. Sometimes it's not truly determined through being a direct descendant, rather being kind of accepted and appreciated by an Indigenous nation. So generally speaking, though, we're thinking about people who have descended from original inhabitants of the land. So in general, in both Canada and the US, the term Indian is used. It's not really politically correct in Canada. but it comes up in historical documents, so I often have to use it in my research. And then there's going to be a broad range of other terms that I'll be using throughout my talk that refer to Indigenous people in different ways. So in the United States, you often hear American Indian being used, or Native American, Alaska Native, so individuals who are indigenous to Alaska, Native Hawaiian, same thing goes, Pacific Islander. And then you have federally recognized tribes, state recognized tribes, and just the term tribe. So already when I'm reading out these names, you can see that there's a lot of kind of complexity because many of these terms are also associated with different kind of political statuses. So doing research in this space is kind of complex on those levels as well. In Canada, sometimes you hear the term Aboriginal, and then you have First Nation, Inuit, Métis, status and non-status. That again determines a kind of relationship to the federal government. And then many First Nations were historically known as bands. So I'm going to be using a whole bunch of different terms. I'll try and be clear about what the term means when I'm using it. Again, sometimes this reflects different kind of like political connections with the federal government or the state government. Okay, so who identifies as Indigenous? Well, in Canada, we have about 5% of the population who have identified in a contemporary sense, so in the 2021 census of population, as Indigenous. In the United States, about 1.2% of the population identify as American Indian or Alaska Native. If you combine this with, like in more recent years, you have multiple, you can classify multiple identities on the census. So obviously that number will be a bit higher if you count people who, are maybe identify as white and Indigenous or black and Indigenous. You might have heard of reserves or reservations in the United States. So these are akin to municipalities, basically where land has been set aside and held in trust by the federal government for use of Indigenous people. Some people tend to think that all Indigenous people live on reserves in Canada or reservations in the United States, but this is wrong. So actually, less than half of the Indigenous population in either country lives on a reserve or a reservation. About 30% of Indigenous people in the US do, and about 40% of status First Nations people in Canada do. A lot of people are just living in cities or other rural areas throughout the continent. If we want to think about differences in outcomes, and obviously this is something that as economists we tend to be very interested in, you'll see here I have for Canada on the left-hand side and the United States on the right-hand side, the high school graduation and the wage and salary income split out by different group. So what you see is for Canada, high school graduation rates tend to be lower for Indigenous people, and wages and salaries tend to be lower as well. When you split this up even further, looking at people living on reserve and off reserve, you see these disparities are quite a bit more stark. In the United States, we see something similar. So high school graduation rates tend to be lower, and wage and salary income tends to be quite a bit lower as well. And again, this kind of grouping everyone into these buckets does mask substantial heterogeneity. Okay, so we know what these stats tell us in a contemporary setting. And this is really, I went online, I downloaded public use data, and I made these graphs. That was pretty straightforward. What do things look like in a historical context? So part of my research agenda has really been to argue that we can't understand these contemporary differences without understanding the past differences as well. But it's not really trivial to put together a picture of what past differences looked like. So the work that economists, demographers, and historians have done in this area has really pulled on a whole bunch of different kind of data sources to paint a picture of economic well-being from a whole bunch of different different ways that we think about well-being. So I'm going to start with this kind of hand-drawn map, which was a map drawn by the physical anthropologist Franz Boas, who was kind of instrumental in documenting the height of many different indigenous groups in the late 1800s. So height is typically used in the absence of data on things like income or even like occupational standing. So by using height, we can infer something about people's well-being in the sense that, generally it's going to reflect people's nutrition in utero, their nutrition throughout their life. So by collecting this data set, economists have been able to go in and use the data on the heights of indigenous people to compare this to other kind of reference group heights. So what we see here is a table from Steckel and Prince, published in a 2001 paper, where we have the heights of several nations, indigenous nations, that resided on the Great Plains. And then you see here on the right-hand side a kind of comparative group of heights drawn from troops in the mid-19th century across a number of different countries. So what you'll see is that Australia, the average height was the highest among these troops at 172 centimeters. But if you compare this to the Plains groups, you see that the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, actually had, and what else? The Sioux actually had heights that were higher than that. Okay, so economists have used this argument to say, well, living standards were, at least in these two reference groups, seem to be better for several of the nations on the Great Plains compared to kind of European contemporaries. And a similar argument was made in the work of Ann Carlos and Frank Lewis, who looked at differences in consumption bundles of different Cree groups compared to Western European groups. And they argued that at least in the time of the 17th century, that's what they're focusing on, indigenous well-being was at least as good as, if not greater, than these European contemporaries. So we know from the IPUMS data, or the contemporary data, that we have these differences in outcomes today. We know historically that, at least from the heights data and the consumption data, that this doesn't necessarily seem to have been the case historically. So where did we kind of come from, and what did these trends look like over time? So this is a graph from work that I did with Dawn Fair and Angela Reddish, looking at wealth per capita in the United States of different indigenous nations. And we'll focus here on the light blue line that tracks total wealth for indigenous groups that were reported in the Bureau of Indian Affairs annual reports. So what you see here is that white wealth in 1912 was actually lower than indigenous wealth. Granted, this takes into account both tribal and individual wealth. And you see that there's this pretty stark downward trend in wealth over the first few decades of the 20th century, where by the 1920s and 1930s, white wealth has actually surpassed indigenous wealth in this data. This, of course, masks a tremendous amount of heterogeneity. So here we've got total wealth per capita of indigenous nations in 1912. Here we've got the same graph for 1927, and you see that some indigenous nations had vastly more wealth than the average white population, which is marked by this blue dotted line here. The same thing is true. You can see a kind of shrinking of the distribution, but the same thing is true in 1927 as well. Now, what do things look like in Canada? We don't necessarily have those analogous wealth estimates in Canada, but this is work that I did with Abubakar Ayash and other co-authors that essentially plots income per capita constructed from kind of equivalent Indian Affairs reports, where we see a pretty stark rise in income per capita and then a drop over the 1920 to 1930 period. We currently don't have the analogous estimates in Canada for white wealth or income per capita. So I can't make the same comparison that I made in that previous graph. here, but that's something that we're currently working on while we're cleaning up the 1900, 1910 censuses of population. So income and wealth seems to have declined over this time period. I haven't gotten into the reasons for this at all, but one thing that we tend to think of as economists is that when people experience dramatic declines in things like wealth and income, people and societies adjust, right? They follow kind of typical margins of adjustment that usually involve occupational respecialization, migration, retraining, so education. So what does that look like for Indigenous people at this time period? So this is school enrollment for the United States and Canada. The US estimates are from Matt Gregg's work, and the Canadian estimates are from the work with Ayesh et al. And what you see is that there's a pretty substantial rise in school enrollment. This is an American policy to try and increase the number of students enrolled in day schools that you can see in just before 1910. And then a less dramatic, but still a rise in school enrollment in Canada. Now, if we split this up by students attending day schools versus residential schools, and look at the portion of the population attending portion of the enrolled population attending residential schools, you see that in Canada this increased quite substantially over the time period, and then in the US it declined. Now, residential schools, I'll get into in a little bit more detail shortly, were kind of live-in institutions where Indigenous children were taken from their families, placed in these schools, and essentially forbidden from practicing any of their cultures, speaking their language. And so when we think about the role of education and potentially leading to a better standard of living, just that general relationship that economists have estimated, it might not necessarily be the case when we're thinking about this time period for this population. And again, I'll get into that in a little bit more detail shortly. So of course, enrollment is one thing, how many people are enrolled, what fraction of people are enrolled, go to which type of school, but we might want to know are people actually going to school as a portion of the population? And it does seem like, at least for Canada, we have these estimates from 1900 to about 1930, the attendance to student population ratio was increasing. Now again, this is mostly driven by the rise of residential schooling during this time period, and that's something that we need to think about when we're considering the kind of historical persistence of these types of institutions. Now, the final thing that I want to leave you with on the kind of descriptive side is that in both Canada and the United States, after Indigenous groups had largely been moved to reservations, there was a kind of concerted effort to convert people into farming. Okay, and so again, we think about what happens when people experience an income shock or a wealth shock? They follow kind of standard margins of adjustment. Some might include respecialization, and that was certainly pushed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the United States and the Department of Indian Affairs in Canada. So if we take the 1901 data that has kind of recently become at least available to a subset of us, probably available to everyone soon, put this together for Canada, and then use the IPUMS data from the United States, we can make this kind of comparison of the fraction of Indigenous people that are in different sources of occupations. Now, one thing you'll notice here is the vast difference in the number of people reporting no occupation. My suspicion is part of this is driven by differences in coding, and so we would need to actually go and compare the coding of both types of data sets. But nevertheless, you can see for farm-related occupations, that's the biggest kind of single group of occupations in both countries. And even that is quite a bit larger in Canada than in the United States. The nice thing that we can do in terms of getting a better economic picture in the Canadian data is we can split this up by whether you're working in traditional employment. So these would be things like hunting, fishing, basket making, things that would have been in line with kind of traditional Indigenous economies. So you see here that there's a non-trivial fraction of people who are still involved in traditional sources of livelihood. Okay, so what do we learn from these new stats? I've just showed you a whole bunch of stuff that has basically said that Indigenous people had relatively high standards of living prior to colonization. We seem to have had pretty substantial economic disruption that happened pretty quickly. And so in the next portion of the talk, what I want to do is to focus on a couple of historical processes that economists have studied that have potentially led to some of this decline in well-being that we have observed. Okay, so overall, I mentioned at the beginning that there's kind of a large amount of, I say there's not that much work, but then there is like a decent amount of work that has focused on a number of different factors that contribute to variation in outcomes in Indigenous communities. So the historical factors, things like treaties, forced coexistence, I'm not going to be able to touch on that in the time that I have. So I'm really going to be focusing on the loss of traditional livelihood and the legacy of residential schools. And then we'll talk a little bit about the contemporary research and then conclude. Okay, so I want to spend a few slides on this paper from 2024 that looks at the decline of the North American bison and the impact that had on the economies of many Indigenous people, most notably the Indigenous people on the Great Plains, but certainly throughout the vast majority of the interior of North America. So the bison were historically a source of tremendous livelihood for many Indigenous nations. They used the bison, they ate the bison's meat, they used the bones for tools, they used the skins for robes and for lodging. And it was kind of a spiritual centerpiece for many Indigenous nations. But at the end of the 19th century, European hide hunters essentially slaughtered the bison to near extinction. And this happens over a period of about 10 to 20 years. Okay? So what happens when an economy or several different economies essentially have their economic underpinning pulled out from underneath them? So we saw in the data, the Indigenous people of the Great Plains had some of the highest heights of many of the Indigenous groups that they had looked at. And this was actually even greater than many of the troops that had kind of comparable samples. So how do these groups go from being one of the wealthiest in the world to one of the poorest in North America today? So we're going to argue that it was the loss of this traditional resource and the kind of constraints on people's ability to adjust that has driven this reversal. So what we do is we look at the share of people's ancestral territory that overlapped with the bison's range at different points in time. We're also going to combine this with anthropological accounts of reliance on the bison. And so what we do is we say, okay, you experienced this rapid shock if you were in the region of the rapid slaughter. So this is this brown region where people lost the bison pretty quickly. And if you also have been recorded in anthropological accounts of having relied on the bison. Okay? And then we're going to compare that to people who never relied on the bison. So what do we see? Well, we also use the heights data that were collected by Franz Boas, and we essentially plot a event study. So we compare, this treatment group to this control group and look at the change in the outcomes. We see this decline in heights over the decades following the bison slaughter. So this gives us a point-in-time impact where we see, okay, there was a meaningful change in the economic well-being of these nations. Then we use income data through the 40s, 50s, 60s, all the way into the 21st century to say there was this level shift down in income that persisted over that whole century. So what happened? Why didn't we have this type of economic adjustment? So again, traditional channels would include migrating to economic opportunity elsewhere, respecializing, retraining. So what kinds of institutional features could impede these channels? Well, certainly a variety of different federal policies made it difficult for Indigenous people to adjust to this shock. But one of the kind of things that we argue in the paper is that there was very limited access to capital for many of these bison nations in the time period surrounding the slaughter. So what we find is that bison communities that had early access to banks were better able to adjust to the shock over the long run. So what is the takeaway here? Well, the kind of unique history and the institutions, in particular the structure placed on Indigenous communities by the BIA, this interacted with the process of colonization in a way that set bison communities into a completely different economic trajectory than these non-bison communities. So again, there's probably a lot going on. I don't want to say it's only access to capital. There were limits on sovereignty, on personal freedoms, but certainly access to capital, access to markets is something that was driving quite a substantial amount of this persistence. Now, again, people typically, will try and adjust to economic shocks. But what happens when you overlay one of the main adjustment processes with a kind of harmful assimilative institution? So in both Canada and the United States, the federal governments, in kind of combination, in varying degrees, with the Christian churches, operated this network of boarding schools for Indigenous children. So they were taken from their families, placed in live-in institutions where they could not speak their traditional languages, they couldn't participate in cultural activities. Many Indigenous nations who maybe had a cultural or a spiritual practice of keeping their hair long were forced to cut their hair. So really a kind of destruction of culture. In Canada, this culminated in the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history, where it was deemed that this residential school system was a form of cultural genocide. Perhaps then, not surprisingly, given the kind of intensity of these institutions and the role that they had in Indigenous communities, economists have been interested in trying to understand the legacy of these schools on those who were impacted. So there's work in the United States and in Canada. A lot more of the work has been done in Canada, probably for data availability rules or reasons. These intergenerational effects have also been of interest. So what happens if you have a parent or a grandparent who attended these schools? In general, both in Canada and the United States, the economics work has found that the first generation of people who attended the schools tended to have higher levels of human capital. I will note that saying higher levels of human capital is not a value judgment, right? That's not saying this is great, we need to bring back these types of schools. This is just saying that people were placed in the schools, forced to attend school, and so it's perhaps not surprising that the levels of schooling ended up being higher. That being said, the estimates of the intergenerational effects tend to be a little bit more mixed. And they're mixed in a way that generates a little bit of a puzzle compared to what we know from more kind of general economics work. So in Canada, at least, Don Fear's work has shown that the children who attended residential schools tend to have higher levels of human capital. But both Don's work and some of my own work has shown that the children of the parents who attended tend to have lower levels of human capital. So this generates a little bit of a puzzle, right? Typically, children whose parents have an increased level of human capital have they have higher levels of human capital themselves. But we're seeing this reversal in the standard relationship that has been observed in the literature. So what do we argue? Well, we argue basically that the cultural disruption and then also the disruption of the kind of traditional kind of parenting role models both played a role in the negative intergenerational impacts of residential schools. And so in particular, one of the things that I look at in my work is how the reserve system, the community that is formed in a reserve, might actually form a buffer against the harmful intergenerational effects of residential schools. The other thing that I show in the paper is that communities that ended up being closer to a cultural center today have we don't observe that negative relationship in these communities. And so I think that I will say the work that I did in that paper is kind of suggestive of this cultural channel, but I think it provides an interesting avenue for future research in this area of how culture can really be used to support human capital endeavors. Okay, so I argued that there was this destruction of the kind of traditional resource, that the standard modes of adjustment were not available to Indigenous people, and in fact, the educational system, which generally is a mode of adjustment, was not done in a very culturally sensitive or appropriate way, and actually done in quite a harmful way. So what has the contemporary literature told us about different policies and programs that can assist in improving educational outcomes in particular? So the work that I'm going to talk about is drawn from Canada. Again, I think that it's data accessibility is a little bit easier for working on these topics there. But I do think that some of the institutional features that make this work unique when studying Indigenous groups would also apply in reservations in the United States. So first of all, there's an enormous amount of student aid literature, just generally, that essentially shows that giving people money for college does tend to increase rates of educational attainment and completion. This is true for Indigenous nations. So in what was my job market paper, I studied this large post-secondary funding program for Indigenous students in Canada that was cut back in the 1980s. And so what I look at is how the cutbacks affected educational attainment of those who are eligible relative to those who are not eligible for the program. And so you see here that there's this decline in completion of trades and a decline in the completion of college. Okay, so that's pretty standard, and people have documented very similar things in the literature around the US, other work in Canada, and elsewhere. The kind of unique thing that I point out in the paper is that the share of people with no certification goes up. So what that means is that in response to the funding cutbacks, people are dropping out of school, okay? High school, that is. And so what I argue is that it's the local labor market conditions that matter. If the return to a high school degree is low, which is the case on many of the reserves that I was looking at in the sample, then when post-secondary funding is cut back, it maybe no longer makes sense to finish high school. And this is something that is echoed in some of the documents that were published by the government and Indigenous groups at the time when they cut back this funding. So what's the implication of this? Well, whenever we're doing a cost-benefit assessment of post-secondary funding programs, in particular, if we're focusing on Indigenous populations, we do need to think about the impact on the high school margin. So that's something that I think, if we just took an off-the-shelf economics model or paper, we maybe necessarily wouldn't have this insight when it comes to schooling for Indigenous children. What else can we look at? So there's an enormous range of active labor market programs across the world, in the United States, in Canada, in many developed countries, and in many cases, these programs actually target Indigenous people directly. So they're kind of designed in a culturally sensitive way, delivered by potentially like on the reservation, so that they're accessible to Indigenous groups. And so in work that I did with Dawn Fair and Kelly Foley, we look at this program in Canada called the Aboriginal Skills and Employment Training Program, which essentially gave people varying degrees of job training, job preparedness, and in some cases just like help with resume writing and job applications. So we compare people who are in higher versus lower intensity programming, and we see that there's quite substantial effects. So this is the annual earnings of men we see that 2 years out, there's almost $2,000 greater income per capita for men who participated in the high-intensity training programs. And we see for Métis people, there's about $2,400 increase in income per capita 2 years following participating in the program. We see similar findings for women, though the magnitude is actually a little bit higher. What we don't see when we just look at the aggregates is for status First Nations people, we see we don't find an effect of these training programs. So we dig into this in the paper, right? Because we obviously want to understand what's happening. And we see that status First Nations people who end up transitioning to off-reserve employment, maybe they still live on reserve, but they just work off-reserve, they do see a return to this labor market program. And so the implication here, we think, is that supply-side policies are not going to be as effective when there's kind of barriers to demand, right? So if there are limited job opportunities on demand and you give people a bunch of additional job training, if it's hard for them to find a job, there might not necessarily be a return to that type of program. And so if you can reduce barriers to creating demand on reserves and reservations, that's one way of contributing to economic development. Now, finally, I'm going to highlight a job market paper out of the University of Toronto by Noah Spencer, who essentially looks at the difference in schooling outcomes for people who go to school on reserve versus those who go to school off reserve in British Columbia. And so he's going to use a strategy that exploits the fact that some people move on reserve, some people move off reserve, and those families do that at different times. So he can basically compare the age of, the length of exposure to a school. He finds that every additional year of on-reserve schooling for children aged 10 to 15 reduces high school completion by 2.6 percentage points. So this is quite actually substantial, and it's larger than the typical effects that we see in the literature. So what he argues is that this is due in large part to underfunding of reserve schools. So what does that mean? Well, in Canada, schooling is operated by the federal government on reserves, but provincial governments in cities. And the per capita student funding is not necessarily equivalent. Okay, so what he's saying is not necessarily something about the reserve environment. He's pointing out that these schools are underfunded. And he actually shows that once funding increases in these schools, that high school graduation difference is reduced. The other thing that I want to point out about this paper is he shows that First Nations, like culturally relevant pedagogy for First Nation students who attend school off reserve is also actually beneficial in terms of increasing educational attainment. And so that is not necessarily the focus of his paper, but it's another piece of evidence that I think suggests that we need to pay a little bit more attention to culture when we're thinking about human capital for Indigenous students. Okay, so I probably have 5 minutes, 3 minutes maybe. So where do I think that we should go as a discipline? I think that certainly looking more into culture and resilience. How can culture kind of support the market economy? How can it support human capital acquisition? And then what are these factors that kind of drive resilience, that drive resistance to some of these historical harms? The other thing that I think we can do more of is leveraging administrative data. So in Canada, the Research Data Center program allows people to essentially access like Stats Canada data at almost any institution. I think that there's certainly more that we can do with the administrative data in the United States. It is just a little bit, it's more challenging to work with the restricted access data here because the data centers aren't as widespread. The final thing I'm going to point out is just understanding more about the institutional features on reserves or reservations. So this is something that I think is particularly important for understanding economic development, human capital acquisition when it comes to Indigenous peoples, and in particular on reserves and reservations, because there's just so many kind of institutional complexities that mean you can't just take an existing paper and apply the insights to a reserve, you kind of need to have the economic analysis looking at that particular region. Okay, in the 2 minutes, I'll say a couple of reflections. So I mentioned the institutional complexity. I think that makes it a little bit difficult and difficult for researchers, and also the reason why we need more work specifically in this area. A couple of things that I'll point out. I can't get to all of these, but I think that as a discipline, we do need to come up with a little bit of a maybe better plan for what consultation looks like in economic research. So any time that you do work focusing on Indigenous populations, it is more common now, certainly in Canada it's common, to engage in a kind of consultation process to make sure the work that you're doing isn't creating any harm, is actually answering questions that are relevant for the communities. But that consultation process looks a bit different for economists who maybe are working with data for the entire population, right? And I think that we don't yet have a good sense of what the consultation process looks like. And so that's like something that I've just been reflecting on, and that I hope that I can contribute to as I continue work in this space. The final thing I'm going to point out is everything that I've talked about today has been recorded by governments that are generally run by settlers, right? So even any of the historical data has been collected by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It's not really been up to Indigenous populations which data has been collected. And so the stories that we're able to tell are limited by the people whose decisions have gone into collecting those data, right? So I'm going to just kind of leave that as a caveat. Whose story is ultimately told depends on who is governing the collection of the data. So to conclude, I do think that economics has a lot to contribute in this area, in particular for understanding those kind of historical processes, what types of policies can be implemented to try and increase well-being for everyone. But this type of rigorous economics research does need to be combined with humility, engagement, and respect for Indigenous people and their knowledge and their sovereignty. So I will leave it there and then welcome questions.
So we have a couple of minutes to take some questions. Members of the SMA, the Senior Alexander Association, will walk around with microphones. If you have any questions, just raise your hand and we'll try to take some questions. We have like 10 minutes.
I think there's a couple.
Thanks so much for your talk. It was really fascinating. And I'm glad that you ended on this idea of whose story are you ultimately telling. I'm interested in your decision of the wording you chose regarding residential schools and the buffalo slaughter. I'm Native. I had a great grandfather that was in boarding schools. Your description of them was that they were culturally erasing, which is very true. But you neglected to talk about the extensive abuse and murders that happened there, and I'm curious as to why that's not part of the story. And the same is true for the buffalo slaughter. Yes, they were slaughtered, but they were not slaughtered for hides. They were slaughtered to kill Indigenous peoples, and yet you didn't mention that. So I'm curious, I understand you have a young audience. Was that something you didn't want to share because it is very violent, but it is also very true? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's so I think I was trying to balance. I think you're right in the sense of there is a young audience, and I was trying to kind of balance talking about it from a little bit more of an objective point of view. But I think, you're absolutely right. Residential schools we've seen this in the news very recently. They're uncovering bodies at residential schools. And I think that just you kind of hit the nail on the head that it was more a choice to, that it is a young audience, and I didn't necessarily think that it was maybe appropriate to go there, but.
Good evening, Matt. Thanks for coming here. Looking at the wealth figures for some of the early 1900s, what were the groups and nations that had those like vastly disproportional, or I should say much higher levels of income, and what drove those figures?
So that's in reference to this figure here. So a lot of nations in Oregon and Washington, one thing we're trying to uncover with the wealth data is a big portion of wealth is the value of land. So we are trying to work out how people actually constructed the value of land. It's not actually clear from the reports. So we've been going into the archives to read what people have written about the kind of like the reason for saying that this parcel of land is $1,000 and this parcel of land is $100. So I think that I'm a little iffy giving a solid answer on that until we've like fully determined, what is leading to these differences. But again, a vast majority of those differences would be driven by land.
Thank you.
The heights of the Plains Indians. I heard about this before, and to sort of second, it was a big deal for them to have the access to the buffalo. But there was a technology of hunting the buffalo that was introduced by Europeans,
Yep.
horses and firearms. Do we know anything about what Indian heights or other measures of health prosperity was before the Europeans showed up on the Great Plains?
So in terms of measurable data on this, the heights data would be the kind of main source. Trying to think of so the heights data, one thing that we've done with that is the way that we kind of look at changes in heights, because it's measured at a point in time. So we basically can group people into cohorts, so we know when you were born, essentially. So that can give a little bit of insight on before and after. We haven't done that, and I don't know of work that has done that. So yeah.
Yeah, it's partly a what is question.
Mm-hmm.
Suppose the slaughter of the buffalo by the Europeans hadn't occurred, would the Indians have done it themselves?
I don't think so. I think that the from what I've read, based on Indigenous people's relationship with the bison, was that it was more of existing imbalance, and yeah. So based on what I've read, I don't think that would have been the case.
All right, thank you so much, Maggie, for everything, and your room for here.